Hello everybody, thank you so much for coming to our 2022 My Last Lecture. This is the first one we've had since pre-COVID, and that was 2019. So very excited that we were able to have My Last Lecture in this in-person format again, and very excited that all of you guys came out tonight. To give a little bit of background on the event, My Last Lecture is the largest and only student-nominated professor faculty award on campus. So super exciting that I hope some of you guys voted and were able to honor your professors. We're also really excited to be part of UCLA Week as part of the I Love My Professor Day, so also very excited for you guys to be here. And to give a little more history about the Marty Sklar My Last Lecture event. The Marty Sklar My Last Lecture event, 50 years ago, students came together to come give different professors that they really appreciated an opportunity to give a lecture of what they would say if it was their last day on Earth. 10 years ago, we were able to revive this tradition through the Alumni Scholars Club with the help of Marty Sklar, who was an alumni scholar and UCLA alumnus. He graduated in 1956. He went on to work at Walt Disney in a variety of different capacities, was very involved, worked with Walt Disney himself, and helped open basically every theme park until his retirement. So very, very excited. And we would like to thank him and his family for giving us some of his energy and his hard work and his time into bringing this event back. So yeah, that's the event of, that's what the My Last Lecture Award is, and very excited for y'all to be here. With that being said, I'm going to announce and give a little bit of a background on this year's recipient. We're very, very excited to announce, I guess it's been announced before, but announce again tonight, that this year's recipient is Dr. Jeffrey Malloy of the Life Science and Molecular Cell and Developmental Biology Department here at UCLA. I won't go into too much detail because I'm sure Dr. Malloy will do a way better job of introducing himself than me introducing him. But with that being said, I want to turn the mic over to Dr. Malloy and give him a chance to answer. What would you say if today was your last day on Earth? Thank you.
Thank you to the Alumni Scholars Club. Thank you to all of you for being here and for being amazing students of mine and for nominating me and for conversations we've had. It's really humbling and incredible to be standing here in front of you at this event. When I got the notification that I received this award, it was a pretty amazing moment for me. I kind of did a little bit of a double take. People who have received this in the past or have been nominated, who've given this talk in the past, have been some people that I recognize and some names that I really look up to and consider to be teaching influences and teaching mentors. We had somebody from our department who many of you might know a couple years ago, Dr. Yuka Karanen, who won this award. Will Conley, Josh Samani, a lot of names of people who teach classes that many of you may have taken. And so it was really an honor to be a part of that group of people. Now, one thing I would say before I get started is I would be remiss to not point out one thing I also noticed when I look at the list of names of people is that with the exception of one person who's won this award, everybody on that list has been a man. And so I think that does also indicate that we have a long way to go. We'll talk about this a little bit today in making sure that we're promoting the success and celebrating the successes of all of the members of our community. So something to keep in mind as well. And that's not to take away from accomplishments, but just to encourage us all to collectively think about how we can be more inclusive and even better in celebrating our community's accomplishments in the future. So, in thinking about giving my last lecture, this is something that I kind of went back and forth and changed what I was going to do quite a few times. There was one point where I considered just showing a slideshow of some of Toby's best pictures. And while I'm sure that wouldn't have been the worst talk you've ever been to, I thought, maybe I should think about a few different things I might want to say if I had one last lecture to give. So here's a little roadmap of different things that I want to talk with you about today. So we're going to start off, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction, I'll tell you who I am, where I come from, how I think about things, and then I'm going to pose a question, and we'll all think together and kind of answer that question together. I'm going to do a little bit of a side tour and talk to you about a slightly nerdy academic theory, and then we're going to brainstorm together and think about how that theory applies to our lives. And then finally, I'm going to give you a final farewell or a few last words. So starting this off here, an introduction. So who am I? Kelly just told you my name, and many of you have had me in your classes before. I'm Dr. Jeffrey Malloy. I was born in Illinois, in Champaign, Illinois, a little college town in the Midwest. My family is actually here today, which I'm really honored to have them here. They drove up from San Diego today to be here and hear me talk. But my family, I was born in Illinois, and I moved out to San Diego when I started 8th grade. So I'm kind of a Midwestern kid, but also a Southern California person at heart. This is a couple of pictures of my family. So this is on the top, this is my husband and I and Toby, who many of you recognize as a valuable co-instructor of mine. Toby is up here and my husband is here as well. And then this is my family, my mom and dad and sister, and my adorable niece and nephew who are here still paying attention as of 5 minutes into the lecture. So they're all here supporting me as well. These are some different aspects of who I am, my personality, things that I enjoy outside of academics. So I really enjoy the outdoors and traveling. So in the middle column here, these are some pictures from some of my favorite adventures. This actually, bottom one, this was cool. I went with my husband to South Africa. We got to see some rhinos in person, which was really cool, an amazing experience. And that was in January of 2020. So it was our last big trip right before the world shut down. So that was kind of a special memory. And then also some other things I enjoy. Some of you who know me may know that I'm a bit of a New York Times crossword nerd. I love doing the New York Times crossword. I love cooking. I'm vegetarian, so if anybody in here likes cooking and likes cooking vegetable-focused things, this is my favorite cookbook of all time. Highly recommend it. But I like cooking, and then I enjoy listening to podcasts and different audio format things. So these are some aspects of my personality. And academically, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my academic journey. So I told you I moved to San Diego before I started high school. I also went to college at UC San Diego. So I didn't go too far from home. I went to UC San Diego. For those of you who haven't been to La Jolla, who haven't seen the UCSD campus, our freshman dorms were across the street from the ocean. A better view from our balcony of our freshman dorms than I'll ever be able to afford the rest of my life. So it was an amazing place. I got to surf in between classes. But that's where I met my husband, and it's also where I I started out undeclared, and I learned to love molecular biology. I majored in molecular biology there. And then I came up to LA for grad school at UCLA. So I came here for grad school. My grad school degree was a Ph.D. in molecular, that's my current department, in microbiology, immunology, and molecular genetics. So I studied microbiology. I studied specifically this little bacterium, which may be hard to see on the screen here with the lights, but the green in this picture is this bacterium, Burkholderia pseudomallei. The red you see around it are these little flagellar structures that it uses to swim around inside of cells. And so I studied how that bacterium moves around inside of cells and spreads from cell to cell. All right, so that's what I did in grad school. And when I started grad school, I was absolutely positive that I wanted to be a bench scientist, that I wanted to spend my career working at the bench, pipetting, doing kind of what we think about as traditional science. That was the path I was on. Very soon after I started grad school, I realized that, I like thinking about science, I like talking about science, but the pipetting wasn't so much for me. But one thing I really did enjoy, I discovered doing in graduate school, was when I was a teaching assistant, I really enjoyed getting up in front of and talking to students and helping students learn things. When students had that kind of aha moment in a classroom, that was a really rewarding moment for me. I felt like I got to learn and engage with students. And so this is an aspect of who I am that I really kind of discovered and explored more in graduate school. When I finished graduate school, because of that, I went on to do a postdoc, and which is, for those of you who might not be as familiar with kind of traditional academic trajectories, a postdoc is kind of a little training period that a lot of people do after they finish a PhD to kind of move on and help them become a little bit more independent in their research. And so the postdoc I did was called a discipline-based education research postdoc. It's a mouthful. But I did that postdoc at UCLA in the Center for Education, Innovation, and Learning in the Sciences. Rachel here is the director of SEALS and has been a really important figure in my trajectory. So SEALS was a great place where I learned to really think about teaching in the same way that we think about science. Right? Just as in the laboratory, you might walk in, you might test a hypothesis, gather some data, think about that data, revise your hypothesis, go back and do another experiment. My time at SEALS taught me we can do the same thing with education. So these are some pictures of some projects that I kind of took on. Started when I was a postdoc at SEALS, but I started collecting data and thinking about persistence of LGBTQIA plus people in STEM majors at universities across the country. I thought about different ways in which we can present information to students and how that impacts students' retention of information. I thought about, for those of you who have taken my class, many of you have participated in growth mindset modules that I do with my classes. And so that's another thing that I kind of developed and thought about collecting data and thinking about student impacts when I was a DBER, a discipline-based education research postdoc at SEALS. When I finished that postdoc, through a little bit of a skip and a hop, I ended up becoming a professor teaching oops, my microphone just cut out. Let me see if this other mic works. Hello? All right, I'm going to do my best to talk very loudly, and I apologize if I'm difficult to hear. The captions are here as well, so hopefully that helps a little bit. But I'll talk as loud as I can. If I ever get too quiet, just give me a little signal, and I'll try to speak up a little bit. All right. So after my postdoc, I went into this teaching track position, academic position at UCLA. Staying in the same place. I really liked it here, so I'm staying here. And in that position, I continue to teach. I teach LS 7A. A lot of you have taken that class. And I also do a lot of education research and think about outcomes for our students and creating more equitable outcomes for students at UCLA and across the country, and specifically in science majors. So that's what I do. Now, before I go any further, I want to talk to you a little bit about my positionality in science. And I think that this is a really important thing for me to talk about for a few reasons which will become apparent as we continue our discussion today. But I want to tell you a little bit about who I am, because who I am has inextricably kind of changed how I think about science. It's impacted how I think about science, how I do science, how I ask questions, and the types of answers I get when I ask those questions. So, I'm a cisgender man. I use he, him pronouns. I'm white, I'm able-bodied, and I come from an upper middle class background. I'm a member of a privileged identity group who has historically determined what questions get asked and how they get asked in STEM and at the university in general. I'm personally committed to inclusivity and social justice in higher education and in STEM, and I strive to view scientific topics through a social lens. So I aim to counter historically dominant narratives in science by centering the experiences of historically minoritized populations in STEM. I'm not perfect, and so I invite you to assume good intentions, but as I ask my students to every quarter, I invite you to please challenge me if I ever fail to live up to these expectations. All right, so I tell you these things not just kind of as a hollow exercise, but because as we'll kind of talk about and explore together today, who I am and those identities shape how I think about the world around me. All right, so thinking about identities. One identity that is very important to me is my academic identity as a biologist. This is a picture of me in graduate school. I don't do this anymore, but this is a picture of me in graduate school being a typical biologist and pipetting something, taking care of some cells. Right? So I'm a biologist. That's a core part of my academic identity. So when I thought about a last lecture, what I might say, I thought about that identity as a biologist. Right? I thought, what does that mean? What does that really, why is that an important part of my identity? And so when I thought about biology, biology is a really broad topic. It encompasses a lot of different things. But when you break it down to its core, biology is the study of life. Biology is the study of life. All right, so this is a picture of a textbook that we use in the class that I teach. The title is actually very similar to the title that you'll find in a lot of biology textbooks on a bookshelf. How Life Works. All right, that's a really big title. And even though we typically think about biologists looking through microscopes and thinking about some kind of esoteric data, maybe, biology is really a topic that connects to everything that we do. Right? When we think about how life works, we're thinking a lot more than just about how cells are moving around in your body. Right? So, a question I have for you. I'm a biologist, and I'm thinking about how life works. But I want to back up from biology and think about an even broader topic for a minute. I have a question for all of you. Biology is the scientific study of life. So what is science? All right? This is a big question. Maybe it's one, if you've been in my class, hopefully you remember engaging with this question before. But this is a question that if you haven't been in one of my classes, you haven't taken the LS series, 7 series at UCLA, maybe you haven't ever really explicitly thought about this question before. So I'd like everybody to take a minute. When you're able to, pull out a device, go to menti.com. There's a code here. It'll ask you to enter a code. And just start typing in a few words that come to your mind when you think about the word science. What is science? I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes to start working on this. Internet's running a little bit slow, looks like in here, but we can see some of these words as they start to pop up. I'm sure this will be updating a little bit slowly and lagging. As you're finishing this up, we have a limited pool of words here to work with, but let's look at this pool of words. All right? I'm really excited because I actually see some really cool words here. So a lot of times, if you went out on the street and asked people, what do you think of when you think about science? You might see some words, like chemistry, biology. Maybe you'd see some haters saying nerds, right? You'd see life. Curiosity maybe is something you'd see pretty often. But some of these other words, innovation, creativity, those are really cool words here. And those are words that we might not always associate with science, but I would argue that those are a core part of science. Those are a core part of the scientific endeavor, right? Curiosity, progress. Some of these words are words that are very unscientific sounding words. Right? So I want to use these words as a jumping off point to have us think about how science is actually a lot more than just, let me change back over to my other screen here. That science is really a lot more than just looking at a microscope, right? Or looking at some bar graphs, or looking at some data. Science is a lot more than that. Science is based on observations of the natural world around us. But beyond that, science is an inherently creative endeavor, right? When we think about science, we think about questions, and we think about creative ways to answer those questions. Science is subject to influence by our society and culture. Who we are and the questions that we think about shape the science that we do and the answers that we get. Subjective. There's a word you might not often associate with science, right? But if the questions we ask in science depend on who we are, then our own personal perspectives and bias inescapably come into play when we think about answering scientific questions about the world around us. Right? So in short, what I'm trying to convey here is that science is not neutral. Often when we think about science, we think about this objective, detached observation of phenomena, but science is inherently not a neutral endeavor. So I'm going to share with you a couple panels from a really great online cartoon. If you've never seen this before, I encourage you to go look up this cartoon and kind of read more about it. This is called Science Under the Scope, done by an artist and a scientist named Sophie Wang. Sorry. Oh, my microphone is back on. All right, so on the panel here, we see Sophie saying, this is Sophie and Sophie's experiences and identity, friends, perspective, community, job. All of that is attached to Sophie here. Right? And Sophie is saying the biggest danger of the idea of objectivity is that it allows us to pretend that science is entirely neutral. That we can separate ourselves from our experiences, from our perspectives, from our society, from our humanity. That's not possible. That will never happen. Right? So instead of pretending that we can all be unbiased, the ideal method of achieving objectivity is to actually include as many inherently biased perspectives as possible. So if we look at this picture on the left, we have a lot of different people from similar perspectives kind of looking at a problem, but they're missing an entire angle, right? So the perspectives that are missing, those are the ones that are going to generate illuminating critical questions that we haven't thought of already, right? Those are the perspectives that are going to generate questions that don't arise in thought that begins with the lives of dominant groups, right? So instead, we should aim to have this less biased method of science, where we have a lot of different inherently biased perspectives, looking at a problem from different perspectives so that we can be aware of all of the different bias that exists and come up with new, exciting, illuminating questions. Right? So this idea is called strong objectivity. The idea that rather than relying on a single person to be objective, we must include or even start from the perspectives of people who have been historically marginalized and excluded from scientific conversations. Right? So if this is important, if this is what we're going for, all right, we need to think about who's included in scientific conversations right now. So who gets included in the conversation when we think about science? This is from 2010, so this is a little bit outdated here, but we're looking at the population of the US, we're looking at some demographics. And on the right, we're looking at the science and engineering workforce. Now, I know that you can't read all of these little labels necessarily, but what I hope is obvious here is that the science and engineering workforce is not necessarily representative of all members of our population. All right, the science and engineering workforce is very largely white and male identified. All right, the science and engineering workforce does not include a lot of these other voices of people with different kinds of perspectives from society. If we look beyond racial demographics or gender demographics, and we look at one thing I told you I've studied before is LGBTQIA involvement in science. And so if we look at transgender and gender nonconforming students versus their cisgender peers, they're more likely to leave STEM majors. If we look at LGBTQ plus students versus their straight peers, LGBTQ plus students are more likely to leave STEM majors. Underrepresented minority students are more likely to leave STEM majors. So we are not including all of these different perspectives in the scientific endeavor right now. And the obvious question is why? What's happening? Right? Why aren't we including those perspectives that are so important for this idea of strong objectivity? So this is Beverly Tatum. So Beverly Tatum is an American psychologist who asked a really profound, important question in 2003. This is a best-selling book. Many of you may have heard about it or read this book. Why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? Right? So Beverly Tatum put some words to a question that many people had been asking, just looking around at high schools for a long time. Why do we get natural segregation of people into different areas? Right? So we could take this question and we could reframe this question to fit our purposes for our conversation today. And say, why are all the able-bodied, cisgender, straight white kids sitting together in the STEM classroom? What's happening? Right? So in order to understand this question, I'm going to talk about a nerdy academic theory. All right? So I'm a biologist, and so when I think about these social issues, when I think about how people get together, I think about ecological systems. All right, so many of us have seen some kind of a diagram like this. If we're looking at species that exist in an ecological system, maybe we're interested in preserving an endangered species. Right? We're not just going to be able to look at the biology of that species. We have to look at that species' interaction with other species around it. We have to look at the environment. We have to look at human influences on that environment. We have to consider that entire ecological system that that species exists in order to understand what's happening with that species. So in the same way, when we think about humans, we are not an exception to that rule. We exist in a complex ecosystem around us, and our ecosystems share some things in common and vary in important ways. When we're thinking about what's happening with humans, we have to think about that entire ecological system. All right, so this is a picture that's kind of a classic picture from an American psychologist, Urie Bronfenbrenner, that he proposed in 1979. He had been talking about this theory for a long time, and this theory was kind of a key player in getting the Head Start program passed in US Congress. Urie Bronfenbrenner was a really important voice in getting us to think about human development, not just as an individual endeavor, but as a complex ecosystem. All right, so Bronfenbrenner proposed that, we have an individual. If we're thinking about what's happening with an individual, we have to think about some of the features of that individual. But that individual every day interacts with other systems, right? They interact with family members. They go to school. They receive health care. They interact with peers. And so Urie Bronfenbrenner described those different systems that individuals interact with every day as microsystems. Right? These microsystems are small systems. They vary from person to person. And they're composed of different things that you interact with every day that shape your daily experience. Now, those microsystems are not independent. Right? Maybe a child gets health care from school. Right? Maybe their parents interact with their teachers at school and influence the kind of education they get. And so those microsystems interact to form different mesosystems. And those microsystems interact with each other to form mesosystems. We'll talk about an example of this in just a minute. All right? Now, we all experience multiple different mesosystems. But those mesosystems are shaped by bigger forces. They're shaped by policies, they're shaped by laws, they're shaped by banking institutions that determine whether you can get a loan. All right, so those larger things that indirectly exert influence on people's lives, Urie Bronfenbrenner called those the exosystem. And finally, all of that exists within larger cultural values and norms that oftentimes we don't even think about. All right, so those cultural values and norms he called the macro system. So I know I've gone a little bit on the nerdy route now and talked you through some different things, used some big words that may or may not make sense to you immediately. So what I want to do is think about an example. All right, so we have a couple of different students here. On the left, we have Brooklyn. All right, so Brooklyn is a black, queer, trans, and non-binary student. Brooklyn is able-bodied, a US citizen. Brooklyn's dad is a delivery driver. Brooklyn is a first-generation student in college. And Brooklyn identifies as a working-class student. All right? Now on the right, we have Brad. Brad is white, straight, a cisgender man. Brad is able-bodied as well. Brad is also a citizen. Brad's mom is a professor, and Brad's dad is a physician. And Brad is an upper-middle-class person. All right, so we have these two students. Now, if we think about the ecological systems in which they exist in a common macro system, right? They're both US citizens, they both, let's say, grew up in Los Angeles, and they're shaped by the cultural context around them. So what is some of that cultural context? Well, we might think about heteronormativity, right? From the time you're born, oftentimes this is a picture of children's clothes that says, sorry boys, daddy says no dating. Right? So from the time you're born, we assume as a society that you're going to be straight, that you're going to have a romantic relationship, be interested in romantic relationships with a person of the opposite gender of you, right? So that heteronormativity, you can imagine how Brad and Brooklyn might experience that differently growing up. Cisnormativity, right? Again, Brooklyn is transgender and non-binary. Brad is a cisgender man. And so when Brad and Brooklyn fill out surveys their entire lives, Brad will come across gender, male, female, and know exactly what to check and feel comfortable in that identity. Brooklyn will experience that same survey in a very different way, in a marginalizing way. All right, so Brad has always had people refer to him by the correct pronoun. Brooklyn maybe has never had anybody assume their correct pronoun on the first go. All right, so these two people experience cisnormativity in society very differently. Cultural values. All right, so we all grew up, we probably saw an image like this somewhere in school, no matter where you grew up, anywhere in the world. There's a set of cultural values that we often try to instill in young people. Honesty, positivity, determination, respect. Right, so a lot of these common cultural values shape how Brad and Brooklyn think about the world. And some of these values are common values that many people share across the country or across the world. And some of these might be a little bit more unique to Brad or Brooklyn. Right, so maybe Brad grew up in a family where success was thought of as kind of an independent endeavor. Right? Success, it depends on you. Brad was taught to pull himself up by the bootstraps and work hard and he would succeed. Whereas Brooklyn, coming from a working class background, maybe Brooklyn was always taught more that success is a community effort. Success is something that you engage in with your peers. Together we achieve success. All right, so some of these cultural values they share in common. Some they might have a little bit different emphasis. But those are going to shape how they view the world. Ableism. Brad and Brooklyn are both able-bodied, so maybe they never had to think about physical access to spaces, but both Brad and Brooklyn may have suffered from ableism in society and how it thinks about people's mental health, right? Maybe Brad and Brooklyn have not been able to miss a day of school when they haven't been feeling well mentally because of ableist societal norms. Sexism. On the left, this is another picture where I expect you can't read all of the exact numbers here, but this is, on the left, this is since the beginning of the United States. The number of women who have been in Congress is about 3% of Congress has been women. And even if we look at our current Congress, it's about a quarter women, right? And this is just considering binary male, female, and man, woman genders. And so sexism is alive and well in our society and shapes what these two view as possibilities for them. Currently in the news, right, we're thinking about sexism quite a bit as we think about women's bodily autonomy, or the bodily autonomy of people with uteruses, being shaped by governmental forces. All right, so sexism is playing a role in the development and the environment of these two individuals. Politics. Maybe Brad and Brooklyn both are moderately politically engaged. Brad follows on Twitter, thinks about Democrats and Republicans and races, but maybe Brooklyn is looking at politics and engaging more with stories like this. This is a story from last week on NPR. Texas Supreme Court okays state child abuse inquiries into families of trans kids. As a trans kid, that might really impact Brooklyn's life. All right, so those politics can really shape how Brad and Brooklyn are viewing the world. Racism. This is a picture, a screenshot I took last week, a Google image search scientist clip art. You can imagine that Brad might see himself in that picture. Brooklyn might not see himself in that picture. All right, we all know in the past weekend we've had to think about this again. Brooklyn has to walk through the world thinking about how their skin color might impact the way that people interact with them and might even put their life at risk in different situations. Brad might sympathize with that, but Brad's never going to live that experience. And historical context, right? So this is a picture. Oh, my microphone's out again, so I'm going to turn up the voice volume. This is a picture of Elizabeth Ekberg, part of the Little Rock Nine in 1957, as a group of 9 students was trying to integrate schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. You can maybe see in this picture, this is a pretty famous picture, so some of you may have seen this before, a mob of students behind Elizabeth Ekberg who are yelling, who are expressing vitriol against this student who's just trying to attend school. Right, 1957, not too long ago. Brad and Brooklyn also see in their history books, they see a lot of faces of white men. Men that maybe will look like Brad will look one day, but maybe Brooklyn doesn't see himself in that picture in the same way. Right? So that historical context also shapes Brad and Brooklyn. So these are a lot of different factors that maybe some of you, hopefully some of you can identify with at least one of these factors that's really shaped your daily existence and how you think about everything you interact with in the world. Brad and Brooklyn grew up in this macro system. They exist in this macro system. Now, Brad and Brooklyn decide that they want to go to college. All right, so when they decide that they want to go to college, in addition to having this macro system shape them, they're also going to be subject to some exosystems, some parts of society that indirectly impact their daily existence. All right, so let's think about what kinds of components of that exosystem there might be. School systems. Brad and Brooklyn, we said maybe they both grew up in LA, but they probably grew up in different parts of LA. All right, this is a map of Los Angeles, and we're looking at schools in Los Angeles that are in the bottom 5% of school performers in the state of California. There's not an even geographical distribution there. If we line up this picture with a picture of racial divides in Los Angeles and with a picture of economic divides in Los Angeles, you might notice that these schools are not randomly distributed. Right? So school systems are an exosystem that are indirectly impacting the existence and the development of these two students. Now at college, these two students are going to encounter different major requirements. This picture, the exact details of all the things it says aren't important. This is a picture I pulled from a UCLA college major advising website that talks about some highly selective majors at UCLA and what other majors you might want to consider in case you don't get into one of those majors. All right, so major requirements, major selectivity are something that are going to influence Brad and Brooklyn's existence at the university. Now, if they want to switch majors, switching majors can be a really good decision for a lot of students, but it can also add time to degree for these students. And so that can be a costly decision, and that costly decision might impact these two students differently. Federal financial aid policies. As an upper middle class student, maybe Brad is less reliant on these individual federal financial aid policies than Brooklyn,
And so these policies are going to impact them differently. University policies. This is a picture, I'm actually going to read this to you. So this is a picture from MIT, from the registrar's office. First year grading, what you need to know. First year grading is designed to ease your transition to MIT by giving you time to adjust to factors like increased workloads and variations in academic preparation and teaching methods. You start with pass or no record grading during fall and IAP terms and transition to A, B, C, or no record grades for spring semester. Standard A to F grading begins in your second year. Right, so this is a university policy that varies between different universities that is going to impact indirectly the daily existence and how these two students experience the university. So we've got some things that make up the exosystems of kind of their school experience for these two students. Now when they get to the university, these two students are going to experience some microsystems. All right, they're going to have friends, they're going to have peer groups, they're going to have mentors. All right, and those peers and classes and friend groups and mentors are not independent of each other. You've probably got some friends that you met in class, some mentors that have suggested classes and impacted the classes you've taken. Right, and so those different microsystems are going to interact with each other to form a mesosystem. Now, all of us, I mentioned earlier, experience many different mesosystems all the time, every day. So at the university, maybe Brad and Brooklyn are taking some classes in STEM, and maybe they're taking some classes in gender studies. Those two spaces might represent different ecosystems for Brad and Brooklyn, different microsystems and different mesosystems for Brad and Brooklyn. Maybe they have a specific friend group that they interact with in their gender studies classes, a specific mentor network, right? They have some extracurriculars that they participate in that are related to their gender studies classes. And maybe they have a totally separate group of friends, or maybe a partially overlapping group of friends who are taking their STEM classes with them. They have different STEM mentors. And so when Brad and Brooklyn are in the university, they're existing in multiple different micro and mesosystems, and they're making a decision about what micro and mesosystems they would like to participate in most of the time. All right, so Brad and Brooklyn have a decision to make. They're choosing a major. Which mesosystem do they want to spend most of their time in at this university? All right, now this decision is not just an individual decision that's shaped in this moment by Brad and Brooklyn. It's been shaped by the entire ecological system that we just discussed, that they developed, that they grew up in. All right, so let's look at UCLA and just think about a couple of examples of how they might see those different mesosystems. All right, so I'm taking my department here, one of my departments here, molecular cell and developmental biology. Some of you may be molecular cell and developmental biology majors. And then we've got a gender studies major on the right. All right, so Brad and Brooklyn are looking at these two mesosystems. First of all, maybe they'll look at the makeup of the faculty, or the people they see standing in front of them teaching to them every day. Right, so in MCDB, this data comes from the UCLA Faculty Data Dashboard. In MCDB at UCLA, 4% of our faculty are black. Right? In gender studies, 38% of the faculty are black. Now, to Brad, maybe this is just a passing kind of something that Brad notices and is interesting, but doesn't really impact his daily existence. But maybe Brooklyn views this in a different way and sees people who can relate to Brooklyn, who look like Brooklyn in one of these different majors. That might impact the mesosystem in which Brooklyn chooses to participate. Looking at some of the descriptions of these majors, all right, MCDB, I'm going to read a part of this. So upper division courses enable students to experience how new information is scrutinized and validated by the scientific community. As a biologist, that sounds pretty cool to me. All right, that sounds like an interesting major. But let's look at this other one. So gender studies. Our core courses address the concepts of gender and the body, gender and power, gender and knowledge through a range of topics such as freedom and liberty, social movements, etc. All right, now looking at these, the one on the left sounds really cool to me, right? But Brooklyn has grown up and existed in this ecosystem where a lot of these issues are really salient to Brooklyn. And so when Brooklyn looks at these two mesosystems, one of these mesosystems might carry more weight with Brooklyn. And finally, if we think about the types of classes and classroom environments that students might encounter in these majors, they might expect to have STEM classes that are kind of large lecture courses that emphasize the importance of individual achievement. And maybe in their gender studies classes, I haven't taken many gender studies or any gender studies classes at UCLA, but I've heard through kind of talking to students that a lot of those classes maybe emphasize these smaller discussion environments, right, that emphasize a definition of success that's more communal in nature, right? So again, there's nothing inherently good or bad about either of those systems, but given the ecological system Brad and Brooklyn grew up in, they might experience those systems differently. All right, so Brad and Brooklyn look at these two majors, and in the end, Brad decides to major in MCDB, and Brooklyn decides to major in gender studies. All right, so in this case study, this extended case study that we've looked at, right, when we understand these ecological systems, when we understand all of this context, Brad and Brooklyn's decision makes a little bit more sense. All right, it wasn't a decision they made in the moment. Brooklyn wasn't pushed out of a STEM major necessarily, right? But there are all these different factors that shaped their decision, their complex decision, to spend time in one versus another mesosystem. All right, so how can we use this knowledge to affect change in science and society? We are at our fourth part here, brainstorming session. Because we started a little bit late, and we're in and out. Oh, we're back on. Okay. Since we started a little bit late, we're going to cut short the brainstorming a little bit, but I'm going to ask you to just kind of think silently when we do some brainstorming. But what I want us to think about is I want to give you some suggestions for important lessons I think this kind of framing of the human experience might teach us, and then ask you to think about those lessons and how they apply to your daily experiences. All right, so my first suggestion is that when we think about ecological systems, when we want to impact a student's experience, when we want to impact the experience of someone around us, one of our peers, one of our friends, we need to impact the macro system that they exist in. That's a really big ask, all right? The macro system is this huge thing that sometimes it feels like we don't have a lot of control over. So I would say it's important for us all to meaningfully advocate for a more just, inclusive, and equitable society. Now, this picture, I'm just curious, can I see, has anybody seen this picture before? Show of hands. All right, so I see some of us are maybe familiar with this picture. For those of us who aren't familiar with this picture, this is actually a picture from the AIDS epidemic. Silence equals death. This was a campaign that's largely attributed to an activist group called ACT UP. But during the AIDS epidemic, for gay men, thinking about AIDS and advocating for different policy changes and different societal attitude changes was literally a life or death question. All right, and so this poster, I think, emphasizes the urgency that applies not just to that situation, but I would argue to advocacy in general in macro systems that we all exist in. Not acting is not a neutral act. Not acting is acquiescing to the current state of affairs within a system. So I would say it's incumbent on all of us to meaningfully advocate for changes in this macro system around us. All right, so how might we do that? There are a lot of different possibilities here. These are just some of my suggestions. We can talk about things, right? Now, talking about things might seem like a very small step, but it can actually be a really radical act in many different situations. In Florida, there was recently a law passed that made it so that in schools we can't talk about sexuality, we can't talk about gender identity with students, right? So simply talking about and normalizing discussion about issues can shape how society thinks about them. Don't assume, right? Normalizing, asking people about pronouns, asking people to reveal different aspects of their identity that they're comfortable sharing with you, but not assuming people's identities can be an important way of shaping the macro system around us, fighting against that cisnormativity. Educating ourselves and educating others about historical context, right? The 1619 Project is an effort to frame American history, to reframe American history, and think about how slavery and how oppression of people has really been sewn into the fabric of American society and culture in our historical context. And so thinking about accurate historical representations
that tell the story of a diverse group of people in the United States, that can be an important act to shape our macro system. And finally, protesting or rallying or demonstrating for causes can be another really important way that we can get attention of people around us, that we can let people know what's important to us, and that we can affect change in our society and culture. All right, this one, we're not going to do this, but I want to give everybody just 30 seconds to kind of think silently to yourself right now. I want us to think about what are some ways that you can create a more equitable macro system. What are some actions that you might take? I'm going to give us 30 seconds in silence to just think about this individually. My second suggestion for what this model can teach us about how we can affect change in the world is that this model can teach us that we can do some small things. We can shape microsystems that impact people's daily experiences, right? And by shaping those microsystems, we can celebrate different lived experiences and perspectives and promote equity in our daily lives. So, some examples, some ways in which I shape microsystems as an instructor and a faculty member, how I try to shape the lived experiences every day of people around me. So in my classes, with the help of Dr. Braybrook, who's a really important co-instructor of mine who's really helped me think about a lot of this stuff, we started implementing learning pods in our classes. So we started shaping the way that students interact with peers in their classes by assigning them groups of other people to stick with the entire quarter and talk to. We have those students kind of form pod agreements so that they can think about how their interactions with each other can shape their experiences in positive and negative ways. So that's one way in which I attempt to shape that classroom microsystem. I also show in class, when we talk about biology, in a unit on energy and enzymes, we talk about societal issues because we know that we can't separate scientific issues from society at large, right? And so we'll talk about food deserts in Los Angeles and how that impacts your probability of having different metabolic diseases appear over the course of your life, right? So we talk about those societal issues because we know that to impact scientific change, we have to also impact social change. And finally, for faculty and staff, for kind of my colleagues and peers, I try to this is kind of a newer thing that we've started doing, but I try to have these kind of get-togethers or create events and spaces where we can share identity and be among people with similar identities and with similar perspectives so that we can kind of have those safe spaces to explore identities and talk with each other. So this is a poster from a recent event, an LGBTQIA+ faculty and staff meetup. And by creating those opportunities, I try to create spaces within those mesosystems where identity can be explored and discussed. All right, and then again, I'm not going to do the Mentimeter here, but I'm going to ask us to think about, let's take 30 seconds again, and I want you to think about one way maybe in which you can impact the daily experience microsystem of the people around you. Right, so let's take 30 seconds. All right, again, I look forward to talking with some of you about some of those ideas. The last tip that I think we can really take away from and think about from this ecological systems perspective is that we can redefine success. This is a cartoon maybe some of you have seen before. I really like this cartoon. So this is a picture of a bunch of different animals, different kinds of animals. And a professor figure is standing in front of them saying, okay, so for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please go ahead and climb that tree. Is that a fair assessment? So that is a definition of success that comes from a single individual, and maybe that definition of success actually works for this individual. Maybe for that professor, climbing that tree is something that took a lot of work, it's something they practiced and they got good at, and so that's their definition of success that they're imposing on the people around them. But I would argue that homogeneous definitions of success are going to result in homogeneous groups of successful students. Right? If we just consider grades and GPA to be the definition of success, we're going to end up with students who have developed within those ecological systems
in situations where grades and GPA were a really salient feature, were something that those students could think about all the time. All right, so this is a little quote I want to read you from one of my favorite academic papers that I've read in recent years. Success for All, a call to re-examine how student success is defined in higher education. Alternative views of success must be normalized to advance institutional and societal goals. By listening to new voices, e.g. amplifying minoritized students' views of success, and considering new definitions of student success, education researchers, and all of us in this room, can take the first step toward changing the system that is preventing students from achieving success equally. All right, so again, we're not going to respond here, but if we thought about some alternative ideas of what success might mean, instead of just looking at grades and GPA, maybe we think about contributing to your community, right? Brooklyn's macro system around them, taught them that those values of community and contributing to community are a really important way of defining success, right? So contributing to your community for Brooklyn might be an important marker of success. Career satisfaction might be another important marker of success for some people. Maybe for some people, improving their mental health is a marker for success. There are diverse definitions of success that we need to incorporate in order to respect the different ways in which different people experienced the ecosystems around them. All right, so success is often narrowly defined by institutions rather than individuals. And so we might think about, as an institution, UCLA or larger societal factors, societal institutions might look at this and say, Brad was a success, Brad stayed in, was retained in a STEM major, and Brooklyn represents a failure because Brooklyn left a STEM major and went to do something else. But I would argue that success might mean a lot of different things to different folks, and that narrow definition of success is a definition of success for the institution, not for those individuals. So Brad found a major he really enjoyed, a STEM major. That is a marker of success for Brad. Brooklyn found a major that is a major that Brooklyn really enjoyed, where Brooklyn felt like they could engage in community definitions of success and improve their community. That is a marker of success for Brooklyn. Right? Success can mean different things for different folks. When we think about our inequities of STEM and our lack of diverse perspective, that represents an institutional failure. That represents things that we are not doing as an institution to attract people into our mesosystems, into our STEM mesosystems. But it may represent, these pictures, this data, may actually represent individual successes of many students who exhibited resilience and exercised agency in leaving STEM majors and going to mesosystems that were more aligned with their cultural values and with their ecosystems that they developed in. One last thing. So I want to leave you with a final farewell. All right, I want to leave you with actually two thoughts. So I'm kind of cheating here on my final farewell. I'm going to leave you with two thoughts. Now the first is actually an idea that kind of came about. This is an article that I wrote when I first started teaching, after I taught my first class at UCLA. I wrote this article, and it started off as something I wrote as kind of like a little mind dump on a note on my phone, and it turned into something that I submitted to be published because I thought, this is something that other people around me might be experiencing as well. And so I wrote this article about experiencing imposter syndrome as an instructor. I was standing in front of these classes of 300 plus students and thinking, who the heck am I to be teaching all of these people about science, to be shaping their scientific careers and their academic outcomes? Who am I? Right, so this is a little excerpt from that. Ever since my first experience as a teaching assistant in graduate school, I've looked forward to the day where I would be the person standing behind that podium. Now that I'm there, I can't shake the feeling that some cosmic accident delivered me. What qualifies me to stand in front of a classroom and explain the mysteries of biology to hundreds of eager students? I've spent immeasurable hours convincing my students and my peers that they're qualified, that they're good enough, that they're extraordinary, but I worry that I might be the exception. Right? To some of you, maybe this sounds like kind of a familiar feeling, this feeling of being an imposter, this feeling of being unqualified and people just haven't yet figured it out. Right? And so I went on to think about more of my experiences in the classroom, and ultimately, what I settled on was looking back through my emails, right? And looking back through messages that students had sent me. And there are some quotes here. These are from some messages that students sent me after I finished teaching them. Where they said, thank you for increasing my love of biology and making my first quarter at UCLA a blast. You gave me a strong foundation in biology and instilled confidence in my abilities to perform well at UCLA. This is a picture of an origami frog that a student of mine made me. They got me started doing iNaturalist, where you take pictures of different wildlife around you and upload them to be used by the scientific community. And they started making me little reward tokens for doing that. So this is something that was really meaningful to me also, that was kind of a marker from a student that they cared, that I had impacted them in some way. Right, so this is 4 students. I have taught thousands of students in my time as an instructor at UCLA. But ultimately, looking back at these responses from students, it struck me that if I've impacted one person out of the thousands of people I've taught, if I made a difference for one person, then I've made a difference. Right? So to this day, I still have feelings of imposter syndrome all the time. Whenever I stand up in front of a classroom, I think, who am I to be here? But I know that if I've impacted one person, then I'm doing my job. Right? And I hope that all of you can take something from that away and think about that in your own lives as well. Even if you're not making huge changes in these macro systems and changing the entire world and the way that we do science, if you're impacting the experience of one person around you, you are succeeding. All right? The final thought I want to leave you with is actually a picture. Does anybody recognize this picture?
No.
My nephew doesn't recognize this picture. Anybody in this room know what we're looking at here? I promise you, this is a picture. We're not just looking at a blank screen. Yeah, what's this picture?
That's the Earth.
This is the Earth. All right, so this is a picture of the Earth. You can see it right here. If you look really carefully in the center of that circle there, you see a little blue dot. All right, so this picture was a picture that was taken by Voyager 1 in 1990, on Valentine's Day 1990, as Voyager 1 was leaving the solar system for the first time. Before it left the solar system, it was programmed by NASA engineers to turn around and take one last picture of the Earth before saying goodbye. And this is the picture it took. Right now, this is a really powerful picture to me. I have this picture hanging in my office, along with a quote next to it. And I want to read that quote to you right now. All right? I'm going to let you know how I think about this picture and how it impacts the ways in which I think about the world. So this is a quote that comes from Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan looked at this picture and said, "Look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you've ever heard of, every human being there ever was, lived out their lives. The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hunter and forager, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every king and peasant, every young couple in love, every mother and father, hopeful child, inventor and explorer, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived here on a mote of dust suspended on a sunbeam. There's perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. Thank you.
But on behalf of the Alumni Scholars Club and the Alumni Association, Marty, Sklar, and his family, and of course, all the students that voted for you, I would like to present to you this formal award. This little plaque guy, I'm sorry, my fingernails all over it, but you can keep them.
I have one other short anecdote to share with you. So my family is here. When I told my family that I got this award and that I was going to give a talk, and my niece was there. Maddie, can you wave to everybody? Some of you can maybe see my niece. My niece was there. My niece said, "You're getting an award? Does that mean you're retiring?" Not quite yet. Thank you so much.